Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot and member of the PMDG 737 tech team. In this tutorial we are going to discuss the descent in the PMDG 737 in Flight Simulator 2024. So we are currently approaching the top of descent. We have around 7.5 miles to go. This is a pretty good moment to request your descent from air traffic control. Anything between 5 to 10 miles is normally going to work pretty well. A small word of caution though, if you are more than 40 miles from your top of descent and ATC makes you descend on their own, or you just requested early, which is much too early, then selecting a lower altitude on the MCP and pressing altitude intervent is actually going to initiate a new cruise segment rather than initiating an actual descent. So when ATC gives us a descent clearance, which could either be at pilot's discretion or when ready descent, then simply select the MCP altitude down to a lower altitude, wait until you reach the actual top of descent, and then the airplane is going to start descending all on its own. However, if you request descent and you simply get a descent clearance, set the lower altitude and press the altitude intervent button to start the descent yourself. In today's tutorial I, however, want to demonstrate something, the so-called energy compensation feature of the 737. So when you overfly the top of descent and you did not receive any descent clearance earlier, you will notice that the airplane is going to maintain the altitude. As you can see, VNAV Alt is the active mode, and the target airspeed decreases. This can be rather dangerous, and that's why I want you to be aware of this, because it is going to go right down to the amber band. So when something like that happens, always go speed intervent, change over, and go back to a normal Mach number, so that you do not just slow the airplane down. Always remember, changing your Mach number by more than 0.02 requires an ATC clearance. Now, let's say that we are in a situation like this. ATC has simply cleared us to descend a little bit late. Now, we eventually get our descent clearance. What are we going to do now that we are high on profile? So the first thing is to set the new altitude. Let's say we're cleared to flight level 240. The second thing is to press the altitude intervent button on the side over here, which you will see changes the airplane from VNAV Alt into VNAV Speed. Third, close the speed window. And now the airplane will start the descent on its own. Now, in order to make this as optimal as possible, we can play with the target speed to get ourselves right back onto profile. So some flight simmers would simply use the speed brake. And while you can do that, it is not very efficient because it simply destroys energy that we've already put into the system. So what happens if we simply increase the target speed for the descent? We are now about 2,000 feet above the profile at a very high altitude. The airplane wants to descend at 245 knots. Let's see what happens if we insert 255 knots as our descent speed indeed. Now, let me put that in and watch what happens to the vertical deviation up here. So, execute. Now let it recalculate the VNAV profile. And you can see suddenly we're only 1,100 feet above the profile. Let's change that again. Let's try 265. Execute. And look at that. Suddenly we're exactly on profile. So that is how we do this. If you are high on profile and you're at a high altitude, simply change the target speed to a higher airspeed and the airplane will be able to catch up with the profile very, very easily. Now, at low altitudes, this would be rather different, but we are going to get to the low altitudes later on in this tutorial. In the meantime, let's talk about what's probably the most important mode and airplane behavior in your descent, and that is right up here at the flight mode annunciator. So you got two different modes that you can have in descent. The first of them is VNAV Path. VNAV Path is going to maintain the vertical path that has been calculated by the airplane over here. But when you either become too fast or the vertical deviation from the calculated path becomes too great, then VNAV Path can revert into VNAV Speed mode. In VNAV speed, the airplane is going to track the target speed that is commanded up here by the FMS, but it is not going to track the path. Therefore, always have a careful look at your flight mode annunciator to see which mode is actually currently active. There is a huge potential for mess ups over there if you are not in the mode that you expect to be in. Now, let's take a moment to talk about smaller changes. So, let's say that you just want to change your target speed momentarily. For example, because you may be flying through a cloud like that one, which you expect may be a little bit turbulent. You can do that by opening the speed window up here on the MCP. By default, in VNAV, the speed is controlled through the FMC. As you can see down here, target speed 265, that's what the airplane's flying. If you need to do a temporary change, you can do that by pressing the speed intervent button, which opens the speed window, and you can see that FMC speed now becomes the active mode, provided that VNAV path is active. If the airplane is in VNAV speed rather than VNAV path, the airplane would simply pitch down now in order to chase the target speed that is now getting commanded. So that option always exists. However, if you plan to make a long-term change, let's say that air traffic control would instruct us to fly a speed of 280 knots, for example, then you would not do that through the MCP, but much rather you would go down into the FMC, you would enter the 280 knots, like this, then press execute, and now the airplane is going to command 280 knots, it is going to recompute the VNAV profile for the higher drag that you have at the faster airspeed, and now the airplane is simply going to follow the 280 knots profile automatically. You can see the thrust increasing, and while we are below the target profile, it's going to fly 1,000 feet a minute until we're intercepting the profile, and then it is going to intercept an idle path descent. Going through flight level 300 in the descent, we are going to set the angle of bank selector to 25 degrees again. That is a very important step for you to do, because when ATC starts vectoring you on the approach, the last thing you want is the airplane responding very slowly by only banking to 10 degrees. So always be careful there. Now let's take a moment here to calculate our VNAV path manually, and that is something that you should always be doing. At high altitudes, aka above 10,000 feet, we normally cross-check the vertical profile once every 5,000 feet in the descent. At low altitudes below 10,000, we do that once every 1,000 feet. That is just to verify that we indeed have a correct picture over here and that the airplane is doing what it is supposed to do. So let's talk about how you can calculate the VNAV path manually. So you got a very basic formula, which is altitude times 3. So right now we're in 28,000 feet, so let's take 28 times 3, which brings us to 82, my apologies. Actually 72. Yeah, let's make that 82. See, that's why mathematics is so important for aviation. Now on top of that, we need to add something for our airspeed. For every 10 knots above 200 knots, we are adding 1 nautical mile. And then we add or subtract for the wind. Every 10 knots of headwind means we can subtract 1 nautical mile. Every 10 knots of tailwind, we add 1 nautical mile. So to do the mathematics now, let's make it easy. When we're approaching 25,000 feet, we expect 25 times 3, 75, plus 8, 83, minus 3, 80 nautical miles to go. So when reaching 25,000 feet, we expect 80 nautical miles. We can have a look at the progress page, and we get the remaining distance down here. Do remember though, that since we've planned for the shortcut, we may see a little longer distance down here in the FMC. In that case, you can just go to the fixed page, and you can see runway 24 left is now 90 miles away, and we are about to reach flight level 250, so we can say that our VNAV path is a little bit lower than what we would actually expect at the moment, but as long as it is lower, it's not too much of a problem. It's really when it's higher that you are going to get in real trouble. So as you can see, 25,000, 80 miles are what we need, 87 miles are what we got. So let's continue our descent. In the descent, just like in the climb, we are always going to follow the 3-2-1 rule, with one exception. So VNAV does not account for a vertical speed reduction when approaching a VNAV constraint. So let's make that an example. When we're reaching the slew point, we've entered ourselves the constraint at flight level 106. VNAV is simply going to do an idle path descent all the way down to flight level 106. However, the 3-2-1 rule does require us normally to reduce our vertical speed when reaching a VNAV profile. Now that is one exception where in practical terms we would normally not reduce our vertical speed when we have to meet an altitude restriction. Any other case, we still follow the same 3-2-1 rule that I have already explained in the climb tutorial. So that's always something that you should keep in mind during your descent. Now let's talk about anti-ice, because anti-ice works quite a bit different in the descent than it does in the climb. So in the descent we basically always turn engine anti-ice on as soon as we are entering clouds and the temperature is below plus 10 degrees TAT. The limit that we had on the SAT that we can look up on the progress page 2 does not actually apply in a descent. The reason for that is quite easy. Let's assume that we got a temperature of minus 41 degrees. Chances are in 30 seconds it's gonna be warmer than that when we're descending, so we will need the anti-ice. On the other hand side, in the climb, once the temperature reaches minus 40, when we continue climbing, it is only going to get colder, and therefore we are not going to need anti-ice normally. Yes, temperature inversions may play a role here, but let's make it simple, shall we? So in the descent, always engine anti-ice on when the temperature, the TAT, is plus 10 degrees or less and there is visible moisture that we are currently flying through. Now, let's take one more moment to talk about wing anti-ice. So, as mentioned in the climb tutorial, wing anti-ice is actually used as a de-icer. So, when ice has already built up, as can normally be seen on the windshield wipers first, when ice has built up, you would use wing anti-ice to get rid of that icing. However, there's a problem. Looking at the Boeing 737, we only have wing anti-ice on the inboard for leading edge slabs. So over here, on the inboard 3 actually, here, here and here. You do not have wing anti-ice on the outer one, and you do not have wing anti-ice on the leading edge flap, and you do not have anti-ice on any of the tailplane. That is a problem. Not a major one. Boeing has, of course, evaluated if there is any problem with icing building up on those parts of the airframe, and they came to the conclusion that no, normally it is not going to be a problem. So, nonetheless, ice can build up on those parts of the airframe, increasing the weight and reducing the aerodynamic efficiency of the aircraft. For this reason, when anti-ice is on, the minimum speed before stick shaker activation is always increased. That means the amber band is going to be higher. When engine anti-ice only is used and turned off again, that speed returns to its original. However, when wing anti-ice is used even once during the flight, and that may be only during climb out in the Nordics, that minimum speed is going to stay increased all the way until the end of the flight. For this reason, use wing anti-ice when necessary, but have in mind that it is going to have an effect even if you are landing 5 hours later and the outside temperature is plus 30 degrees. So always have that in mind. Wing anti-ice always increases your minimum speeds. Now next let's talk about the fasten seatbelt sign. So there are generally 3 types of philosophies when the fasten seatbelt sign is switched on. So some carriers do it when leaving the cruising altitude. Other carriers do it at a fixed amount of time, and there are two, let's say, common versions of this. The first one is when the airplane is passing 25 minutes to landing. The second one is 15 minutes prior to landing. The latter is what my former airline has been using, so once you are 15 minutes before landing, or when descending below flight level 150, whichever is earlier, then the fasten seatbelt sign would be switched on. For this reason, always have a look at the ETA on the progress page, have that one in mind. So according to the ETA, we would still have 2 minutes until turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, but since we are anticipating the shortcut, we already got the lower altitude, which means we are already approaching flight level 150. So what are we going to do? We are going to turn the fasten seatbelt sign on. So we are now descending, and we got that decel symbol on our navigation display. The decel symbol always shows up when VNAV plans to decelerate the airplane. So since the D356 Tango point has a 250 knot speed restriction associated with it, the airplane wants to decelerate at that particular point in order to reach the 250 knots by the time we reach the Delta 356 Tango point. Now, let's go ahead and assume that ATC is giving us the shortcut that we anticipated. So we are flying direct to Bavoum. I'm going to press execute. As you can see, since we had previously prepared the airplane for the shortcut, our vertical profile is almost spot on over there. We just have a very slight deviation. But look at that, it reverted into VNAV path. So now what the airplane is doing is to chase the target speed rather than the target path. Only if it comes within 200 feet of the VNAV path, it is actually going to return from VNAV speed into VNAV path to resume its normal deceleration schedule. So let's now talk about what we could do when we are high on profile but at low altitude. Down here the only option is the speed brake, so pull that speed brake all the way up to the flight detent, not across it, and fly the airplane back into the profile. The speed brake is really not very effective on a 737, so early anticipation really helps keeping the airplane under control. And here we go, we're back in VNAV path mode, so now getting back on profile, let's stow that speed brake again. And now we are back on following a standard profile. If you are really low, so below 10,000 feet, there is only one way to actually get the airplane down if you are high on profile, and that is to slow the airplane down to get the drag devices out. The flight crew training manual tells you not to use the flaps to add drag to the airplane, but you will notice that two settings are really going to help. The first one is speed 220, flaps 5 and full speed brake. That's going to result in about 2 to 2,300 feet a minute rate of descent and is really efficient at losing altitude. If you need to descend even steeper than that, decelerate to 180 knots, go to flaps 10. However, that only makes sense if your airplane is not equipped with the performance improvements package. If the performance improvement package is installed, then flaps 10 is not going to extend the leading edge flaps full and therefore not going to do much of a change in terms of the drag. But 180 knots, flaps 10 with full speed brake normally creates the steepest possible descent path that you can achieve in the Boeing 737, leading to the best rate of descent per nautical mile. Now, passing the green dots on the nav display, we are reducing our speed towards 250. Something that I really like on the 7.3 is that the target speed reduces gradually rather than simply jumping to the new position as it does on larger Boeings. That way you can see the target energy of the airplane at any given moment in time. So, we are descending through 10,000. So let's do the 10 checks. The fuel, once again, is balanced. Very slight imbalance here, which is totally acceptable. That's probably due to the scavenge pump pumping the rest of the fuel from the center tank into the wing tanks. So fuel slightly imbalanced, but absolutely fine. And 4 pumps are on. Lights are on, and those are the landing lights and the turn-off lights. If you have an airplane with retractable landing lights, do not turn them on just yet. Then we check that the angle of bank is at 25. We once again do the reverse L check. So differential pressure should be at or below 4, cabin altitude is descending, rate of descent is showing, correct landing altitude is set, and temperatures are under control as well. When you're flying into a very hot area where cooling the airplane on the ground may be problematic, this would be a good point to take the cabin temperatures and really turn them down so that the plane cools down before reaching the ground. Recall is checked, fasten seatbelt signs are checked on, 1 to 1.5 is deselected, and cabin crew, 10 minutes to landing. So the cabin is advised that landing is imminent. And that concludes the 10 checks on the descent. Now we're getting cleared to a lower altitude. Let's descend with the arrivals. So we'll go down to, say, 2,500 feet. Once we're cleared to an altitude and there is no more flight level restriction along our flight path, we can set the altimeters to the local QNH. So 2,500 feet is set, that's below the transition altitude, so we immediately set our altimeters to the target QNH, which in our case today is 1012 hectopascals. Cross-check that both sides are giving you a sensible indications, and then we can continue our approach to the point where we start the frisk check. We'll talk about the frisk check in a moment, but in order to even start the frisk, we have to fulfill a couple of basics. We need to be on the local QNH, since the altimeters are going to be part of the approach checklist that is read immediately after the frisk. Then we have to receive the destination airport ILS or VORs if conducting a VOR approach. And once all of those criteria are met, we can start the frisk check. So as you can see, we just started receiving the idents, meaning that we are indeed receiving the destination ILS now. So frisk check. You go to the performance init page. Over here you have all important information that you need. First we check the frequencies. That's 109.3 active on both ILS receivers and confirmed with the database. Next we check the idents of the, next we check the fixed rings. Runway 24 left, 10 miles, 4 miles. If the weather would be IMC, we would use 5 rather than 4. Next we check the idents. India Papa Alpha Lima, and that is confirmed up here, and that is also confirmed up here. Next we check the standby instruments, where we activate the approach mode and make sure that the RMI is set to anything that we may need, and that the local QNH is set. And finally we check the courses 237, and we got 237 once and 237 twice. When all of that is completed, we are going to conduct the approach checklist, and by the time the approach checklist is completed, we ensure that the vertical situation display is set on the pilot monitoring side. A small word on the vertical situation display, because that thing has a really cool function. Regardless of the QNH that is selected over here, the VSD is able to determine whether you've got the correct QNH selected. You can see this by looking at the runway symbol down here. If the runway symbol sits on the terrain, then you got the correct QNH. If the runway symbol on the VSD does not sit on the terrain, then you have an incorrect QNH selected and should confirm the actual QNH with air traffic control. Really nice little tool. It also gives you a bit of good information. For example, the green dot you may see on the airplane's trend vector over here shows you where you are going to reach your target speed. Really useful stuff. Only works outside of VNAV though. Finally, let's take a moment to talk something that some of you may find strange, and that is that LNAV is active and at the same time LNAV is armed. That is not a bug, it is actually a feature, And what it shows you is that automatic LNAV engagement is available in case of a missed approach. So this is normal for the 737. As we're slowing down for the approach, the airplane eventually reaches the deceleration point and automatically starts slowing down. When the speed reaches the upspeed, we can go ahead and extend the flaps into the first position, so flaps 1. Once we are cleared for the ILS approach, we can arm the approach mode, and as soon as VOR localizer captures, we are going to set the runway heading, which is 237. Now, when approach mode is active, we should also go to speed intervent and set our speeds manually so that VNAV cannot mess you up on the approach. So, normally we try to intercept the glide slope with flaps 5 and at the 5 speed. So, once the speed is down at a nice speed, let's select flaps 5. However, you can select flaps 5 all the way up until 250 knots, especially if you need some additional drag to help you on the approach. However, when selecting a speed, always make sure that the speed target is also moved to the appropriate speed. So right now we are decelerating towards the flaps 5 speed. Now, we can see that we are slowly approaching the glide slope. And as we're doing so, a small piece of advice: the glide slope is not shown on the primary flight display if your heading is more than 90 degrees different from the final approach course. So, let's say you were coming in on a U-turn like this, you would not see the glide slope appear on the primary flight display. However, you will always see it on the integrated standby displays. Very useful stuff. Now, we got glide slope capture, so let's set our missed approach altitude of 3,000 feet up here. And yeah, plane is climbing a tiny bit. Sometimes it does that, normally it doesn't. So let's talk about that 10-mile ring that we've added in the descent preparation. We basically want to pass that 10 nautical mile ring in 3,000 feet above the field elevation, with a maximum of 200 knots ground speed, and with at least flaps 1, preferably flaps 5. If you don't meet that criteria, that's basically your indicator to actually go around, because chances are it will be almost impossible to get the airplane stabilized on the approach any longer. So that's a little restriction that has been added by company procedure here. Now, when we're cleared for the approach, we are going to go down into the FMS. We select the progress page, and progress page number 4. The reason we do this is because it gives us the cross-track error and the vertical deviation. So, with the correct approach program into the FMC, this will show you if you're deviating left or right from center line, and this will show you if you're deviating up or down from the vertical profile. Very useful stuff. Now, established on the approach, let's get rid of the sun shades over here, and assuming that landing clearance has already been received, we can turn on the taxi light, which serves as a reminder for the landing clearance. Now, at some point in the approach, it is recommendable to start working ahead already and turn the engine start switches to continuous, do a recall, and once the recall has been completed, if our simulator would be kind enough not to hang itself up, we would also arm the speed brake. Let's give it a moment here. Sometimes the simulator... Here we go. So, recall, and then arm the speed brake. In visual conditions, we can start to extend the landing gear and configure the airplane for landing at 4 DME. In instrumental conditions, we are going to configure at 5 DME. That is the reason why we've drawn the inner ring down here. However, you can at any time configure before the ring if it seems logical. So if we were flying 200 knots, for example, then I would absolutely be extending the landing gear now already. However, on a normal approach like this one, 4 miles is absolutely sufficient. Let's take a short... Yeah, disregard, that's just some turbulence. So let's take a small moment here to talk about the stabilized approach criteria. By the time we pass 1000 feet above field elevation, and that's above the airport, not the radio altimeter, which can be misled by some hills. By the time we reach that, we need to be completely stabilized. So, 4 miles, gear down, and don't worry about that landing gear warning horn, that is normal here in Palma due to the hills. So, gear down, flaps 15. At this moment we would do the landing checklist down to flaps, and once the speed is at a nice margin we can set our landing flaps, which today is going to be 30. If you're using flaps 40 for the landing, make sure that you go flaps 25 first, let it decelerate, and then complete the landing checklist. So with all of that, we are now established on the approach. Let's go ahead and pause the simulation here and quickly take a moment to talk about the stabilized approach criteria. So, in order for an approach to be stabilized, which we gotta meet by 1000 feet in instrumental conditions or 500 feet in visual conditions, we got to meet the following criteria. Our speed needs to be within plus or minus 10 to plus 10 to minus 5 knots from the approach speed. Our pitch and bank needs to be appropriate for the approach. We need to be within half a dot, correction, 1 dot on the localizer, and within 1 dot on the glide slope. We need to have an appropriate rate of descent, and our thrust needs to be at an appropriate level for the approach. Landing configuration has to be established, which means gear down, flaps at the landing setting, speed brakes aren't. When all of those criteria are met, when flying through the landing gate, we can continue the approach. Finally, if we take a look at the altimeter over here, we can see 2 colored bands. The first one is the white band. That starts 1000 feet above the field elevation. You can notice the radio altimeter does not necessarily represent that, because you may be flying over mountains or over hills, like we did on this approach over here. The second band is the amber band, and that one starts 500 feet above the field elevation. And that way you got both approach gates easily covered on the altimeter. You have the same on the vertical situation display, by the way. If you look down here, you can see we got the 1000 foot gate drawn in over here and the 500 foot gate drawn in over here. So again, really useful stuff. Also note how the runway symbol sits neatly on the terrain surrounding it, indicating that we do not have any altimeter error when setting our QNH. Well, and that, my friends, concludes the descent and approach tutorial for the PMDG 737 in Flight Simulator 2024. Thank you very much for watching. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and from here on we are going to head right into the landing tutorial, which is going to be next. Thank you very much for watching, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.